Chapter 8, The Wizard's Story. There will be a time for questions and lengthy explanations and all the thank yous and other nonsense that needs to be said soon enough, Dedlin Dane snapped irritably, shaking moths from his hat. He was wet, angry, and anxious to get moving now that everyone was out of danger and accounted for. He glared across the fold at the Garnian scouts hovering in the trees, and he frowned. First of all, we've got to get rid of them. We lost most our packs, Day said, feeling somewhat like a drowned rat. Gabriel handed him a towel to dry himself with. You've lost more than your packs, I'd say. Since I saw you last, you lost a perfectly fine fighter craft to a creeper that's been living in the same hill for 150 years, wasted at least 3 days walking in the wrong blessed direction, and nearly drowned in the rising floodwaters of Arrowgreen. You now have 4 Garnian ships escorting you across the country with more on the way, no doubt, and you lost your packs. That probably doesn't cover it. You didn't happen to offend any wood elves along the way, did you? Never mind, I don't want to know. The troop looked sickly at one another. I hope not, Dedlin said. Anyway, fear not, I brought some ample food and some extra clothes, although I wouldn't hope that everything is going to fit that well. He leaned over to Gabriel, and with a concerned and inquisitive eye, he whispered, And how is the, you-know? Feeling suddenly flushed, Gabriel felt for the chain around his neck. Thank goodness the key was still on it. Fine, Dedlin, he said. What a disaster that could have been. We're fine. Well, good. All's not lost then, despite everyone's best efforts. Stardeer's just ahead of us here, among the rocks. I expect no one's against air travel this evening, then? No, they mumbled. Good. Get on board, then. I brought along two more crew members who are new to the wilds, Lake Tobias and Cran Methylard, whom you might remember as the same 2 Tungulan Castle Rangers who first sighted the distressed Median skycraft Tigra last week. They have recently joined the voluntary Knights of Galgaraya, and since they were in attendance of the Secret Council and heard much of what was going on, I agreed with their request to come along with us. We could use an extra pair of hands or 2. They will be acting as your pages on this journey, so don't be too hard on them. They're nervous enough about all this as it is. I'll trust you all to bring them up to speed. We'll need to travel through the night now to make up for lost time. I suspect, I'm making a correction there. I suspect that we've been discovered and that bigger warships will soon be on the way. Things are going to start getting very dangerous before long, so let's start preparing for it. It's time to start thinking for a change. It's good to see you too, old man, Drer Freygood ventured to say. He pulled a moth from his ear. What took you so long anyway? Dedlin snorted at the question and continued marching crossly up the hill. Let's go find that magical cave. Next part. Within the hour, Stardeer was sailing swiftly through the summer evening sky with Dedlin at the helm of his own skycraft, leaving the valley of Arrowgreen far behind. King Day had changed into loose, dry clothes and had joined the wizard at the helm. Drer, Percy, and Ott were below trying to get an early sleep so that they could take the long night shift later. Binder was cleaning up, and Gabriel was introducing himself to Lake and Cran near the starboard rail. The 2 castle rangers stared at the Bersian Prince warrior with eyes as wide as coins, engaging him in nervous conversation as best they could. Day studied the old man briefly. The wizard looked a decade younger than he had back in Tungulan to him. There was color in his sallow cheeks and some suns on his skin. His hair and beard were now braided, pulled back, and tied, much more practical for skycraft flight. His dark eyes were sharp and bright beneath the shadow of his bushy gray eyebrows. You don't know how glad I am to see you, Day said to the wizard. I feared that you were dead. I do have some idea how glad you are, Dedlin replied with a wry smile. I am sorry, but I was tied up with other matters. You'll You'll hear about my recent escapades soon enough. In the meanwhile, how was our little secret? Is it still safe? Day shook his head. Yes? That's amazing, Devlin replied quietly. Not even Gabriel suspects? I don't think so, Day said. I suppose I could tell him? No need to rush. You will when you are ready. It has served your purposes well enough so far. A moment of comfortable silence passed between them. Did the wizards at the council know? I was very nervous. Oh, yes, they knew. That was the reason they hesitated before confirming your identity. I had to explain things to them later, politically, to better help them understand. They found the entire premise delightful. I'm glad. But it does bring up other things. And it brings up other questions, Devlin said. Shh, we have company. We'll talk about this later. Gabriel walked across the deck and joined them. Good evening, he said. All together again. As it should be, the wizard replied with a wink. Devlin, I just wanted to say that I feel responsible for the mishaps we've encountered over the last few days. I was in charge in your stead, and I failed on several counts. I hope that your faith in me hasn't wavered irreparably. Oh, don't be so hard on yourself. He leisurely banked Stardeer around a cluster of oak trees, then leveled it off again, maintaining the ship less than about 20 feet above the scrubby terrain. To be honest, things might have turned out much worse had those mishaps not occurred, he said. In fact, they turned out to be blessings in disguise. By being delayed by the Creeper, there's a good chance that you escaped capture. The day after the Creeper took Percy's skycraft, a fleet of Garnian warships was reported to be crossing your intended flight path. So that old wretched Creeper just might have saved your lives and this mission. By the gods! When I heard the report, I flew like a gale wind. I was very encouraged when I found the crumpled hull of Sunshaft and none of your gnawed bones strewn about the Creeper's den. I shouted with joy, the wizard said. I was a bit too rough on everyone earlier this evening. I was just cross and wet and tired and fearful at Arrowgrain. You were heading in the right approximate direction for those 3 days on foot, generally. Day glanced over his shoulder at the 4 specks on the horizon, following as though tethered to the back of the ship. Don't worry about them, the wizard said, with a devilish light in his eye. I have a plan. I'm anxious to hear, Gabriel said. Tonight was all he would say. Tonight we will lose them. In the meantime, I've made a nice dark brew of roasted Kofik beans in the pantry that should just about be ready. Please have some and share it with the rest of the crew, but don't drink too much. It will make you as jittery as a dragonfly. Next part. Lake and Cran had been given the charge as lookouts that evening and stood as sentinels on the front and back of Devlin's skycraft. The remaining 6 were below, getting much needed and well-deserved rest. Devlin alone remained at the helm, keeping Stardeer at full speed through the twilight and into the coming night, steering a straight arrow course through the southeast for many ongoing hours. But try as he might to outrun them, his ship was no equal to the Garnian's sleek crafts. A very mild midnight sunrise came and went, and now the moonless night was as pitch as coal. It was nearly time for a shift change at the helm, but before he relieved himself from duty, Devlin began to make preparations to lose the Garnians once and for all before he himself retired for the night, as he had promised. 3 of the Garnian scout ships were smaller than Devlin's Stardeer, but one fighter was thrice its size. All 4 of them loomed much closer now that night was upon them, most likely keeping Devlin's ship under surveillance with high-powered night scans. Sometimes Devlin spotted red beacon lights on their bellies, and occasionally a spotlight would come on, aimed in one direction or another, but most of the time the Garnian ships flew without lights, in sheer and utter darkness. Devlin strapped himself into the helmsman's chair and took a deep breath. It was time. Lake, Clan, hold on to something, he forewarned them. It's going to be a wild one. They hurriedly did as he suggested, and no sooner had they snapped the safety latches on their seat harnesses, they heard him mutter to himself, "I feel as though I'm forgetting something. Anyway, here goes." He shut off all the lights. Without slowing, he jerked the steering bar hard to the right, spinning Stardeer directly around in a circle, now facing the oncoming Guardian ships, firing no less than 10 missiles in rapid succession straight at them. At the same time, he flipped a switch that caused Stardeer's levitation vents to open. It released the inert gases that kept her afloat, and she fell like a rock backwards into the thick forest trees. From throughout the craft, Devlin heard frenzied voices. He realized then that he had forgotten to forewarn the rest of the crew to strap themselves in. "I knew I forgot something." The missiles had missed the Guardians, but that was of no concern to the wizard. They hit the trees in the forest all around them, lighting the night with bright orange fireballs. "That should blind them for a while, night scans or no," he said to himself. He quickly flipped the switch again, closing off the gas vents, and the powerful turbines quickly filled them again. The leveled Stardeer off, still crashing backwards through the treetops, pushing the accelerator bar forward with all his might. The ship slowed and slid to a complete stop with a hissing, swooshing roar of air just as several Guardian missiles flew past overhead, exploding in the trees behind him. Everyone and everything on board tumbled and rolled to the back of the ship, and once again, frantic voices cried out from below. "Sorry," he said. A few seconds later, with Stardeer descending slowly down under the dense cover of the trees, back the way they had just come, like a cautious fish sinking slowly out of sight in a dark, deep lake, the Guardians flew swiftly past him overhead, all searchlights ablaze, firing wildly into the distance beyond. Immediately, the wizard turned 90 degrees to the north and began creeping along at a ridiculously slow snail's pace, descending lower and lower into the ancient forest boughs in complete blindness. He lit his console with a faint blue, luminescent glow that was undetectable from more than even a few feet away. Excuse me. By now, everyone was scrambling up onto the deck, clinging onto whatever they could for dear life. Percy raced to the helm. "Did we crash?" he cried. "Devlin, is everyone okay?" "Are we hit?" Binder called. "Shh," the wizard simply told him. "Good night, good friends," he said quietly, heading below for a long-needed rest. Someone take over, if you please. Stardeer is now yours. We are free of the Guardian fleas. So go north until dawn, east until breakfast, and then south until lunch. See you then, if not sooner." The crew watched him retire below. Then they looked around, puzzled, and still completely stunned. Where in the world were they? It was pitch black. The foliage that brushed past them was thick and wet. The air was cool and the insects were loud. Stardeer squeezed past a thick and ungiving tree trunk and then some heavy limbs, causing the ship to scrape and tilt just to wedge through. Strange noises surrounded them. Birds, bugs, unnameable tree creatures who did not like being disturbed at all. They were immersed somewhere deep within some primordial jungle, and there was an unexplainable creepy feeling all around them. "That wizard is out of his ever-loving mind," Binder mumbled. "Where in the hell are we?" Quan had not yet opened his eyes or released the rail. His arms were locked solidly around it. There was a small branch protruding from his hat. He was whispering a prayer that he remembered recanting as a child. "I don't know," Day said, "but I'm going below to try to go back to sleep if I can. I doubt I'll be able to close my eyes anytime soon after that jolt." Suddenly, blinding spotlights pierced the trees from above, grazing past them on the right. He grew instinctively took cover. The searchlights trickling down through the leaves in roving circles as the Guardians frantically scanned, causing strange shadows to dance all around the forest depths. "They're searching for us," Gabriel whispered, smiling out the side of his mouth. "The old coot escaped from them after all." "You said he would," King Day replied, smiling. They knew that the smaller Garnian scout ships would have no trouble following Stardeer beneath the woodland terraces if they knew where to look, but the dark fighter ship above them was much too large to enter the trees. It slowly moved off in the direction of another spotlight that had just come on somewhere to the south, where a golden blaze, ignited from the missile fire, had begun to spread along a short line of dead pine trees. "Good night," Day whispered as he crept below after the wizard. "Night," the rest quietly replied. They were still rattled and in a mild and somewhat jubilant state of shock. "Ingenious," Binder said beneath his breath. He watched the Garnian searchlights fade off into the distance. "But don't tell him that I said so." Dreher Freygood smiled to himself. "Yes, he certainly can be." Next part. Devlin came back up on deck a few hours before dawn, rubbing his puffy eyes. He had been dreaming again, the same uneasy dream that kept haunting him night after night as of late. He was fleeing from something that was trailing him. Something fell and evil, as dark as midnight shadow and as cruel as death, but he could not see what it was, for it kept no earthly shape. It was always coming behind him, always on the move, sniffing, hunting, searching hungrily. It was smart, horrible, and existed nearly in the ethereal. It acted without remorse, and Devlin feared that he held no power over this thing. This recurring nightmare had frightened him from his sleep on several occasions, as it had this night. He began thinking that it wasn't a nightmare at all, but instead a premonition, a vision of something that was soon to come. He vowed not to speak of it to anyone yet, not until he had to. There was no need to frighten any of them any further, but he knew something evil was on its way, and this crew would inevitably have to face it. He took a deep breath to help calm his nerves. He figured he could use some herb smoke. Outside, it was serenely quiet, except for some strange nocturnal waterfowl that cried eerily from some dark river beneath the trees to the west. Percy was at the helm. Ott was standing statuesquely close by on watch, his keen feline eyes gleaming gold in the dark. Stardeer had gotten stuck once or twice through the night as she coasted diligently along, but Percy had just backed her up and found another way through. At this juncture, it was smooth sailing through the middle terraces, and they were enjoying a relatively good speed. The wizard glanced up at the sky through the levels of gloomy leaves, yawning as he stretched. "Ready to get on out of here?" he said, reaching for the onboard light switch. Ott seized the wizard's hand, startling him. Percy directed the wizard's attention to the southern skies. There, past the dark silhouettes of the trees, was a large black space in the heavens where the stars did not shine through. Devlin realized then that it was a Garnian warship, a large mega-hull warship, 100 times larger than Stardeer, hovering silently above the forest with its lights off, watching and waiting, and hoping that the crew of Stardeer would do something careless to reveal her position. The large ships had arrived, and even the tiniest glimmer of light could be detected from above. Devlin whispered, "Like I said earlier, I'll see you gentlemen in the morning, and I'll try to leave my overconfidence with my humility under my pillow from now on where it belongs." Next part. A gold and crimson sunrise foretold of more rain to come later that evening. A stoic Commander Binder had relieved Percy, taking control of the helm of Stardeer shortly after they had risen from the sweltering jungle canopies. The ship was still covered from debris from the forest, leaves and sticks and seeds, insects, a tree snake, and strange little brown animal resembling a lemur or a sloth, which they just caught and released without incident. The crew busied themselves by tidying things up on the ship. Binder flew low, once again at full throttle, heading directly south, following a ridge of hills that rose like the lumpy spine of some great animal. Dreher had risen early and was working on breakfast for everyone. Lake and Cran were setting plates and spoons, filling mugs, washing countertops. Despite the cramped quarters, the crew was in good spirits because, thanks to Devlin's ingenious scheme, they had successfully eluded the Garny and Scout ships once and for all. The trees were thinning out below them, now clumped together in sparse patches between the rolling hills and the mossy tundra. The grass of the oncoming plains was a resplendent green, dotted with wildflowers and vivid colors of summer, bright gold, ivory, white, black, yellow, orange, and lavender. The ship could pass, and would soon pass, the rough outskirts bordering of the far west reaches of Galgaraya and enter the vast rolling treeless plains of Tuz. Day came to an aromatic table of fried ham and fresh baked bread. He was the last to eat, but had 2 portions of eggs, ham, and toast, and topped off his meal with a glass of cold Rama's milk, a welcome treat. He cleaned his own utensils and whisked the crumbs off onto the small square box that he had used as a seat. The box, he noticed, after a closer inspection, was strange in its design. It was apparently carved out of some kind of hard wood, but it was as lightweight as a feather. It looked very odd and very old, and its surface was covered with hand carvings of the moons and the trees and large elegant waterfowl. There was a rippling ocean with a score of large flat-bottomed boats, sails full of wind. The box appeared to have no seams, nor nails, nor screws holding it together, as if it had been carved from a solid block of wood, although by its weight it appeared to be hollow inside. As Day continued to turn it, images changed, disappeared, and then reappeared upon its surface as if telling a story. "What is this?" he asked, intrigued. "Oh, careful with that, Your Highness," Devlin replied, coming up from the lower deck with an old, crumpled map in his hands. "It's a box made by the wizard Jaz in the Kingington Fway. You may examine it and be amazed, but do be careful, it can be dangerous. Jaz was a box maker, you see, but not just any boxes. He was the master of designing and constructing passage boxes, such as the one you're holding. They're strange items with magic that I myself have never fully understood. I brought it along because you never know. It may come in handy." "Passage boxes," Dave repeated. He found a button latch and pressed it. A seam formed and the lid popped open. Inside it was empty. "It's so light I thought it must have been filled with algae stone gas." "No," Devlin said. "Alas, the trees from which this wood was crafted no longer exist on this continent, or any other, I fear. Barone trees they were called, and they were rare, even in the elder days, growing along the coast of Kingington in ancient Norgia. The trees began dying there out of loneliness, some used to claim, despite the efforts of the Mahekian caregivers who tried to preserve their kind. Jaz took the wood from the trees just before they passed to construct the most wondrous items from them. See, the wood of a young, thriving barone tree, or from one already dead, held no power. But the wood taken from one just before its passing could be used for all sorts of wizards' manipulations. It is lightweight and strong, unlike any other, as you can most probably see. The box is magic, then. True magic is only achieved by the complete understanding of physical laws of nature, so that ways may be found to bend or break them without interrupting the natural flow of everything else. The passage box by Jaz is a perfect example of that theory. Well, it looks perfectly normal to me. It is perfectly normal, the wizard explained. All magic is normal. Magic is nothing but precise scientific formulas that alter existing laws of nature. Gravity, thought, energy, motion, sight, light, sound, fire, animals, and so on and so forth. There are nature's functions happening all around us at all times. Wizards learn how to cause these laws to malfunction and or alter while controlling them through exact calculation, experimentation, manipulation, and faith. Magic can be very simple, he said, opening his hand, palm up with a ball of fire appearing to float and roll just above it. Or it can be very complicated. The ball of fire exploded, startling everyone who was watching. The sparks turned into tiny blue butterflies flying away in all directions. I began learning levitation, or the undoing of gravity, when I was about, half your age, and that was my favorite. Then I worked my way up from there. Day spun the box. You said to be careful, he said. Why, Dedla? What does it do? Several things. Most importantly, it teaches. Start by putting your hand in the box. Curiously, Day did as Devlin suggested. He did not know what to expect, so he did this slowly. Further, Devlin encouraged. Day did as he said, further and further. There's no bottom, he finally sputtered. He put his entire arm inside, all the way up to the shoulder, and although on the outside the passage box was only 3/4 of the length of his arm, Day's fingertips could not find the bottom or the sides of it. How far does it go? He asked. No further than the opposite end of the box, Devlin answered, smiling. So, Day said, searching for a logical explanation, actually, my arm shrinks when it goes inside the box. See for yourself, the wizard encouraged. See for yourself. Day peered into Devlin's box and shook his head in fascinated wonder. My whole arm is right there, as normal as can be, but is nowhere near the bottom of the box. The space inside the passage box is different from the space down here. That is correct, Your Highness, Devlin said, looking pleased. Good, you figured it out. There is nearly a square mile in this particular box. Works wonders for storage sometimes. Commander Binder had been watching and listening to this instruction, but he shook his head in disbelief. A square mile, he mumbled. That's ridiculous. Day held it up to him. Try it yourself, Commander. Binder took the passage box. There's not a square mile inside this box, he said, holding the open side of it up to his face. That's just preposterous. He reached his massive arm inside of it to tap the box bottom with his fingers, but he could not do it. Experiencing the same remarkable phenomenon that Day had, he stretched his entire arm inside up to his shoulder, and looking in, the bottom was still far, far away. Don't fall in, Binder, Devlin warned. It's a long way to the bottom. Binder set the box down beside him with the opening facing upwards toward the sky. You're hypnotizing us or using some other sort of wizard's trick, he groaned. A square mile indeed. Silliest thing I've ever heard. What's this? Day said. He dropped an apple into the top of the box and watched it falling inside. Everyone crowded around to watch. The apple dropped farther and farther away until they could hardly see it. Then Day grasped the box and flipped it over, holding it out before him. A few seconds later, the apple fell out and hit the deck at their feet, splattering in all directions, as if it had been thrown off a cliff. Everyone cheered, except Commander Binder, of course. Next part. After poring over the maps and charts, mumbling and measuring, Devlin called a meeting. Okay, time for explanations and answers. Time for revelations and some honesty for a change, he said, marching through them. Time for planning and intelligent preparation. He pulled a wooden pipe. Every time I pause, I'm just correcting something. He pulled a wooden pipe from his small cabinet. Most importantly of all, time for a good smoke of Tungulin's best pipeweed. It's been far too long since I've had a decent smoke, and my head could use some clouding this morning. Let's see if I can get this lit with all this confounded wind. Devlin found a spot next to the master pilot Percy at the front helm, and the rest of the crew gathered around him on the 4 curved stairs that rose from the lower deck up along both sides of the helm. Bacon Clan stood quietly behind the rest, watching the horizons for unfriendlies. Off the port bow, the sky turned a deep grayish purple. Heavy, threatening clouds billowed, and a new wind blew from that direction. Distant thunder rumbled, and bolts of stark lightning lit the earth and the sky beneath. It was going to be the kind of storm one strove to avoid. A trail of smoke left the wizard's mouth and dissipated into the wind. His exploration showed that he savored it. "So, Gabriel," he began, coming back into focus, "how is your leg then, son?" "Fine." Devlin's eyes sharpened. "The truth, Prince." Better," he said. "I wouldn't win a foot race if I had to, but it's getting better. The countryside hike was not good for it." "And how are you, Your Highness?" he asked the young king who stood next to Master Pilot Percy. "Good," he said. "Great now that you've decided to become involved again." "Well, I have much to tell you, Clan. Be a good lad and pour your old man a vessel of ale," Devlin requested. "We're making good time now, and it is time that everyone knew the truth about our mission, where we are going, what it is we seek, and who our enemy is. And if you'll allow, it will be story time. I'll take the time to tell you about the night I was nearly devoured by the cattle wolves, and who it was who flew to Tungulin in the Tiger that fateful night. Let me explain how I was captured by the Garnians, and then how I destroyed the 2 Garnian warships, Godstrike 5 and the Mount of Steel, right on Tungulin's doorstep, and how I barely escaped with my life. And permit me, if you will, to tell you why I changed King Tytel Bantu into a miniature green aardvark and threw him into the royal fountain." That's where we'll take a pause. That's about halfway through the chapter. The Wizard Story Part 1, and next we'll be doing the Wizard Story Part 2, and that should conclude this chapter.